The motivation and background behind our webinar really started with having a lot of conversations with various clients about cloud, about managed services, about various pressures related to their technology service delivery. And you guys are all familiar with kind of the hype and vernacular and buzzword compliance going on out in the media, and it's really difficult to get your arms around everything that's going on. Some of our clients are experiencing pressure from different parts of their organization. Hey, everybody's doing this. It's easy. Why aren't you folks moving faster? And it's just really hard to kind of peel the onion on everything that's going on. So what we decided we wanted to do was share some of the specific experiences, lessons learned, and kind of key takeaways from a number of the activities and conversations that we've had with a variety of our clients. So the goal here, again, is for us to share kind of some of the things that we're learning in this space as we go along, and perhaps enter into a little bit deeper dialogue with everybody here. To sort of set the stage, Casey Green is going to talk about the trends and observations from his research in this area. Lisa provided a great intro to Casey and the campus computing project. As I mentioned at the beginning, I always look forward to the data that Casey presents annually and trying to understand both the shifts and changes, the opportunities that that's creating, as well as the challenges that people feel like they're facing. So with that, turn it over to Casey for his segment.
Marcus, thank you very much for those very kind comments about the work of the Campus Computing Project. As you mentioned, I'm here to provide some context for all the conversation about the cloud, and it's been a long conversation. I think it's now been 4 years, perhaps 3, since the publication of the EDUCAUSE book or edited volume, The Cloud and the Tower. The question that we looked at campus computing over the last several years is, for all the conversation, what's actually going on with deployment? And the data that I'm going to share with you today actually talks about some of the data we've collected over the years, and particularly last year through the 2011 Campus Computing Survey about the deployment. Let me begin with a metaphor. As we went out with our 2011 survey, and that data came back last year from some 500 campuses, typically CIOs or senior IT officers for some 500 institutions across the U.S., we found a couple of things. First, the movement towards a strategic plan is growing. Those numbers have doubled in 2 years, from 2009 to 2011, from 9 to 21%. So while the growth is dramatic, the numbers still remain low. But the other thing that we saw when we asked specifically in the 2011 survey about deployment was the data very clearly suggested a metaphor off the model of low-hanging fruit of low, middle, and high clouds. The low clouds, the easily accessible clouds, game over, game done, turned out to be mail and calendar. You'll see this as we move forward. The middle cloud was probably CMS as a hosted service, and also learning management systems, which initially were campus hosted and now are moving increasingly towards provider hosting. And the high clouds, those most distant, those farthest away, those with the least deployment, minimal deployment actually, as we look at our data, turned out to be ERP, essentially administrative systems, high-performance computing, and also storage. And ironically and interestingly, these are the clouds that are most often discussed in the corporate and consumer market. These are the clouds that are sort of capturing a lot of the attention, and these are the clouds that are often supposed to, at least, offer the best value, the highest bang for the buck, the most performance benefits for organizations that move to what we would characterize as these high clouds. I mentioned that mail was the low cloud, and in fact we've seen a dramatic movement of mail, particularly student mail, to the cloud. And the catalyst for this has really been the offering from Google and Microsoft to host student mail services for colleges and universities across the United States and elsewhere. About 2/3 of the survey participants in the 2011 survey report that they're now offloading, they've outsourced their email services, but it's really student email, less so for faculty and administrative email. One of the movements of this, of course, is that 2011, 2012 are not 1989. Student email addresses are no longer a rite of passage of go to college and get your email account. Students, obviously, of all ages, from 18 to 58 and older, have email accounts before they have any contact with their campuses. In fact, the data from Student Monitor, which does consumer market surveys of traditional undergraduates, reveals that the typical undergraduate age, full-time undergraduate age 18 to 22, 24, has about 3.3 email accounts, one perhaps known to his or her parents and others that are used for other purposes, plus other vehicles obviously for communicating with friends and others, Twitter, Facebook, other mechanisms to get information back and forth. So also, interestingly, we've seen very slow movement towards cloud-based Office apps, Office 360, Google apps in terms of Word, the kind of the desktop application functions. And I think some of that reflects a communications challenge. Although students and faculty are increasingly mobile and increasingly connected to wired environments, the question is, I don't think that the providers have necessarily done a good job of explaining how a cloud-based application is different or works effectively as opposed to the application that's loaded onto your hard drive. When we look at some of the other areas for cloud computing, we see that, I guess I indicated earlier, the middle cloud looks to be calendar and LMS services. We're seeing 20 to 30% of campuses have already migrated to or are converting to cloud and calendar and LMS services for the cloud. And then the low clouds, rather the highest clouds, CRM for analytic purposes, but particularly administrative systems, ERP, research, high performance, and storage remain very distant clouds. And I think the challenges here, one is a sense of risk, not well understood for all the conversation about the cloud. I think that many campus IT officials see that there's some risk in having their data on somebody else's system. The fact that Amazon had some hiccups about 18 months ago has not insulated or helped to dispel the sense of risk. Two, I think also it's important to note that the 5 companies that are the primary ERP providers to higher education, the big ones at least, have not yet really articulated or marketed or provided good campus deployments, case sites in terms of ERP. Trust obviously is a big issue. Again, it relates to the risk issue and control. The fact is that on many campuses, we know that IT officers really, for a lot of reasons, want to feel that they have control over these issues, and they feel that by going to the cloud, they may lose some control over this process. When we disaggregate these data by sector, we actually see not much difference, at least among four-year institutions, on we're running about 20 to 30%, a little higher, upwards of 40% among community colleges. And I think in one sense, you might look at the LMS as kind of a toe in the water, toe in the cloud experience. The providers have moved a bit faster, and there's at least the beginnings of some anecdotal evidence to make a compelling case for the financial and other benefits of software as a service on LMS, given some of the upgrades and kind of leapfrogging back and forth between the various providers. But we don't necessarily see that elsewhere. For example, when we look at ERP, the numbers are minuscule, typically under 5%. Little higher among public four-year colleges. That may reflect some system deployment, the fact that a number of state systems might be moving slowly but steadily towards ERP cloud services, the fact that they're multi-campus, the fact that concurrent registrations, a number of factors may speak to this. The same thing in terms of multi-campus community colleges. But even with the perhaps some multi-campus deployments, the overall numbers that we got in fall 2011 were quite small. Similarly, when we look at research in HPC, computing, again, these numbers are quite small. Obviously, it wouldn't be an issue necessarily in community colleges, minor in public four-year colleges, and even some private four-year colleges. And the private universities and public universities where there may be potential in terms of HPC, again, some of this is enabling infrastructure, enabling resources. Some of the research in HPC also may be going offshore, meaning off campus. But that may be the activities of individual units as opposed to an institutional strategy. In other words, a research group, a lab, may decide to buy cycles from a third-party provider or from another institution, but that doesn't necessarily reflect an institutional strategy. It's more individual unit opportunity. Those numbers, we'll have new numbers for that in November. The 2012 Campus Computing Survey is currently underway. And finally, sort of how do we explain the slow movement? Well, I mentioned earlier that the ERP providers, which represents potentially the largest bucket of opportunity for cloud deployment or high cloud deployment, really have been slow to offer cloud options. If you look at the major providers, they are just beginning compared to some of their corporate, particularly activity in the corporate world in terms of services to entities, comparable sized entities, to offer various kinds of clouds options, resources, and services. CIOs are understandably risk-averse. It may be that CIOs in higher education are among the most risk-averse CIOs across the landscape of public and private and public sector enterprises. Really important, I believe, is the absence of compelling case studies. If we look at the movement to the cloud and also to open source LMS, one of the things that was really important in terms of moving towards open source LMS deployments and also some of the cloud stuff is that the campuses that went out and did it first, those that went on what some might call a journey of discovery to prove that the world is not flat if we make this dramatic change in our deployment, came back and either provided anecdotal or in some cases other kinds of case studies that they shared with colleagues in hallways and conference presentations, perhaps even some written documents, to talk about their experience having done this migration, of doing something different. Higher education, I've mentioned several times, is risk averse, and it's not just a matter of some other campus has gone and done this. We'd like in higher education to know about places like us. So with due respect to anybody who's listening from Harvard, Harvard may be a great logo, but it's not a great client in the sense of a compelling case study because Harvard is so different than the rest of higher education. Perhaps more appropriately, you'd like to have a case study from Mass Bay Community College because Mass Bay is more akin to the experience of and the students and the infrastructure more like the 1,100 community colleges in the U.S. as opposed to the 15 or 20 institutions that are similar to Harvard. Two, part of what plays into this issue is the issue of money. Colleges are not the most creative in terms of financial accounting. I've said a number of times over the past 2 decades we would really need a team of forensic accountants to figure out how much money colleges spend on IT services, both within central IT and across the institutions. One of the key issues about the cloud is it changes the way you account for money in your IT budget. Does it move from a capital expense to an operating expense? And what are the consequences of that, both in a year-to-year and a strategic sense in terms of the way IT units manage money, the way the institution looks at the costs of information. And finally, again, at the risk of redundancy, I would mention trust. This is a trust but verify. And it is really important, I believe, that higher education wants to see somebody else do it. They want to know that they're taking precious resources, in this case, time, money, data, and can place it with a trusted partner to know that those resources are well invested and that those resources, time, money, and particularly data, will be safe if campus officials decide to do so. Let me add, as I mentioned earlier, that the 2012 Campus Computing Survey is now underway. If by chance you're a CIO or a senior IT officer at a campus someplace in the U.S., we hope you'll participate in this survey. If you did not get one of our email invitations to participate, and we just sent out a reminder notice for that this morning, please contact me directly. We'll be delighted to have your campus participate in our annual survey. The results of the survey will be presented at the EDUCAUSE conference in Denver on Wednesday afternoon, November 7th. Thanks. Back to you, Marquess. Any questions at this point?
Thanks, Casey. I've got a little bit of a question for you. Recognizing that the campus computing study focuses on responses from CIOs and directors of IT, could you offer any insights into the kinds of conversations technology leaders are having with their business and institutional leaders? We so often hear about the cost pressures and budget and economic and other funding issues. Are those conversations with the broader institutional stakeholders more than just cost at this point? And if so, what would be your interpretation?
No, I think that's a very good question. We know from our data that IT budgets, like other institutional budgets, have been under great pressure the last several years. I mean, the irony of the last decade, 2000 to 2011 roughly, is that historically over the past 30 years, we used to have kind of this binge and purge cycle. We'd have a downturn, lots of budget cuts, and then the budgets would come back. We saw this in the 1980s, downturn at the beginning of the decade, refresh later in the decade, along with new technology when all the micro stuff began. Early 1990s, big downturn, big budget cuts, refresh of both money and technology, that internet moment that Tom Friedman talked about in The World is Flat as a catalyst to refresh as well. The dot-com and the 9/11 experience became a downturn, and then we began to recover from that in the mid part of the decade, and then the end part of the decade we had a double downturn, which is very unusual. Concurrent with that, of course, has been rising expectations. Everybody wants more. more network, more access, bring my own device. It's no longer one device, it's multiple devices. And with that, particularly for campus officials, non-IT officials, there are too many models that are readily accessible from the consumer and the corporate market, and also among trustees. People say, look what's going on elsewhere. Why can't you do that here? In terms of analytics, in terms of cloud deployment, how do we extract more value out of our IT dollars? How do we get more bang for our IT bucks? I think that that's been a continuing and in many ways now an escalating pressure on IT leaders. So that's not going away. I think one of the issues in terms of as we look at where we've come and where we might be going with the cloud is that in the consumer market and in the campus community, there's been conversation about the potential for higher performance, more effective deployment and the reduction of costs by moving to the cloud, but neither the campuses that have put their toe in the cloud, if you will, nor the providers have necessarily created good case studies, not just epiphany, but some evidence about performance, effectiveness, and cost effectiveness in this movement. So here, unfortunately, as in too much of our other conversations about technology, we're driven by expectation, we're driven by aspiration, we're lacking really good evidence to help close the loop on these conversations, and I think the evidence would be a catalyst for more deployment. Once others know that it's safe to go, we certainly see all this, for example, if you look at the history of open source LMS deployments over the last 6 or 8 years. Once those early adopters went and came back on their own journey of discovery and said it worked, I think that was a catalyst for others to think about open source in a way that they never would, moving from open source applications as backroom tools to broadly deployed applications for civilians in the front of the screen as opposed to the back of the IT rooms, backroom services and resources. I hope that helps.
Sure, that's a great insight. And I think some of the things that I see going on in this space, trying to address those trust issues, I'm about to head off to the Internet 2 conference next week, and they're sponsoring an initiative called Net Plus, which I think really seeks to address a lot of the points that you made around cloud deployments in unifying both the costing and the terms and conditions, as well as creating a security and trust governance structure, mapping those onto kind of more traditional IT controls so that, you know, when service providers and vendors can attest to a certain level of service or security, that it's you know, your trust and verify comment is you know, very appropriate there. And I know the Internet 2 community and Net Plus, they are taking a iterative approach where there's a, you know, proof of concept phase, a service validation phase that they can document and publish as case studies and evidence that this stuff is working, it's cost effective. So I think we're going to see some more initiatives kind of crop up to address what you've you know, identified as kind of barriers to moving forward.
Yeah, if you'll allow me, let me touch on the trust issue and expand this a little bit. Part of the survey for the last several years has also asked about security breaches. You know, what's happened? And what we have seen over the last several years, Marquess, is that, you know, when we started seeing headlines, whether it was in the IT community or the higher ed publications or elsewhere about a security breach at Acme College, in the middle part of the decade and towards the end of the last decade, often this was at the top level. These were data files or IT security issues that applied at central IT. More recently, what we have seen is that these have applied not to stuff that's under the auspices of central IT, but it's been the individual research lab or department that says, look, you know, we've got money, we've got expertise, we don't want to follow the rules at central IT, we're going to hang our own server on this thing, to hell with you guys. I call this the petulant adolescent, in the sense that mom and dad leave me alone and I'm going to go my own way, but make my bed, clean my room, and if I get in trouble, bail me out. And sometimes, at least what our data has shown in the last several years, is where the breaches have occurred on campus, increasingly they are not central IT, they are in fact the small departments or units that go off and alone. And I think that too has made many senior IT officers a bit skittish about third-party hosting of sacred data files. That's not to say that the third parties that would host and secure, you know, either for storage or ERP, don't have more, better resources to do this, but the fact that there have been these occurrences makes, understandably, campus IT officers still a bit skittish about giving up data to third parties, where in fact they feel that they've got control and they've been able to manage it rightly or wrongly on their own, and they've been relatively risk-free over the last several years. But these are also, as you know, these are not a matter. This is not a question of if. For many institutions, it's a matter of when, and how do you minimize the risk of when.
Completely agree. Very good points. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to shift a little bit to how does one take a strategic approach to these issues? What are some of the kinds of profiles of organizations and the strategic underpinnings behind how you approach these issues? First of all, we thought it'd be worth touching on what is the value of taking a strategic approach. Many, if not most, institutions these days have a clearly articulated strategic plan that looks out, some variety of 3, 5, and in some cases even 10 years. And by aligning your technology strategy with the strategic plan for the broader institution, you can really increase your stakeholder support for your initiatives, whether it's a full-blown initiative, major migration of services, or a phased proof-of-concept based approach, by clearly drawing the supporting, foundational elements of your technology and your infrastructure to the strategic plan for the organization, whether it's, a higher ed institution or a commercial entity, can really increase the amount of buy-in and support for your budgeting, for your staffing, and other resources that you need to move this forward. Secondarily, taking a strategic approach really sets the stage for broader decision making, whether that's at the at the broad organization level in things like budgeting, or if it's down at the decision making and priority level within the technology organization directly. Connecting those strategic alignments can really help in that area. It's not uncommon for higher ed institutions, and I'll try to say this politically correctly, to have highly diverse and complicated decision-making processes, very consensus-driven. And again, by tying this back to kind of some of the mom and pop or the mom and apple pie touchstones or themes for the institution can help accelerate your decision-making processes. Kind of peeling that down a little bit lower, your strategic plan for technology and then developing and aligning with guiding principles really helps set the context for your actual initiatives and projects. Whether you're spinning out a proof of concept team to go investigate a migration or delivery of a certain kind of service from a managed services or SaaS or cloud-based infrastructure, providing the right set of goals, context, and touchstones can keep that project team on focus. One of the probably most egregious, worst examples of violating this principle is working with a particular client who was had a cloud pilot proof of concept going off that was a little bit divorced from the IT organization. We got to do this. Let's research it. And they came back and gave this big log dog and pony show about how great all this provisioning stuff was. And at the end, clicks a button and says, "Hey, I've got my VM running. It's in the cloud. I'm done. Isn't that great?" And the service delivery guy is sitting there going, "I can stand up a VM in 5 minutes now. You haven't solved any of my problems. How do I lay down my application infrastructure? How do I manage it and monitor it? What's the security profile of the environment this is running within?" So this, this proof of concept group had kind of gone down the rabbit trail and expended, a ton of time, chewed up a bunch of, vendor relationship goodwill in standing all this stuff up, and it proved to be meaningless. So again, creating those touchstones is very important. Lastly, onboarding the technology team and staff. To some, cloud is a huge threat to to their career. Am I going to get, what do you need me as a sysadmin for if all this stuff's going to run somewhere else and there aren't servers to take care of and power to manage and cooling to worry about? And other folks on the staff are concerned about their own relevancy. Hey, the rest of the world is headed here. We're not doing this. I feel like I'm falling behind. This is not an organization I can be part of because I am going to become obsolete. So you have kind of both sides of the coin there with respect to your staff's perspective on the goodness or badness of the cloud, and tying this back to a strategic approach can again help alleviate concerns, get people onboarded with the direction that the organization is headed. Take this down a little bit level further, and actually look at what is technology strategy and how can it inform us as we think about these hosting and service delivery issues. As we mentioned previously, aligning IT strategy with business strategy is very much a buzzword these days. You'll see it in all of the the popular literature. Well, it really is important, and it does work. It's important to note that this really is a two-way conversation. IT or technology strategies that are created in a vacuum outside of the institutional goals will result in a lack of buy-in, a lack of support with those strategic stakeholders and other relationships that you need to maintain. In the end, you're supporting their operations, and they need to be on board with the direction that you're heading. Likewise, I had a boss at one time who would recite a famous quote, and I can't remember the source, but he used to say that a great strategy that you can't execute on is in fact a terrible strategy. So, making sure that the institutional goals can actually be supported by the technology and by the technology teams, that really is a two-way conversation, and you need to kind of attenuate some of the longer-term institutional goals and maybe focus on some of the foundational pieces of infrastructure and technology before you're ready to attack broader institutional goals. As examples here, how are you supporting teaching and research? If the institution has a goal of leadership in a particular field, either at the regional or state or national or even on the international stage, how are you going to support that leadership role from a technology perspective? Then the elements that fit into your technology strategy. What is your build by partnership position? How do you approach open source? If you do open source, do you staff it and support it internally, or do you look for a commercial affiliate to support it? What's your risk profile with technology? Are you an early stage adopter? Does your institution have a mission of adopting and advancing emerging technologies, or are you more risk averse and more of a late or mid-stage adopter? What's your technology strategy approach with respect to infrastructure? Are you a uniform environment where everything comes from a particular software vendor or hardware vendor, and you look to achieve economies of scale and efficiency through a unified infrastructure? Or do you adopt a best-of-breed approach and then take on the advantages of having best-of-breed solutions, but you've got a little more work in terms of integrating those disparate kind of vendor platforms into your environment? What are your service level commitments? What's your security profile? What are your data security policies and your IT and infrastructure security policies? What levels of risk are acceptable? And we'll touch on the budget financial pieces here in a moment in a little more detail. But what does that look like? Is it growth? Is it flat? Is it declining? From the technology strategy, your kind of long-range vision and positions on these key issues, then take those and distill a set of guiding principles around your cloud pilot or your SaaS or other managed service pilot. You can make some statements around the goals to support your tech strategy. For example, you may have an aging infrastructure that's having difficulty meeting your service level requirements. So, one guiding principle for your cloud pilot might be to improve service availability in the 99, 3 nines, 4 nines, 5 nines, whatever the goals are. and keep coming back to that as a touchstone. So if we move this application, if we stand up this infrastructure, if the high availability components of the overall architecture look like this, does that help us get to our service availability goal? If you're, we'll touch on some examples here in a minute. If you're in an institution facing, enormous growth in one of your technology platforms or services, maybe scale and growth and meeting those growth demands is part of the cloud goal here. We talked about cost a bunch. What are your cost goals? And again, how can you achieve those? And then looking again very carefully at your security and other tech risk posture. Within the kind of the context of all of those things, just some things that we've seen and learned as we've had conversations around this is sometimes it's hard to be realistic about your institutional priorities. Some leadership may talk a lot about lofty goals or ideal goals, but in the end, it's really coming down to budget and how can I reduce my budget and just maintain parity with the service levels that I'm delivering. One thing that you can do is, you can look at your recent budget reviews, other decision-making processes that have gone in the past, and really, come back and say, okay, are we really being realistic about how the institution is broadly making decisions here? And use that realistic context to set your strategy and guiding principles. Casey touched on this a lot, as we have seen it as well. So the security and risk profile, both from a IT data security perspective, as well as the risk around service interruptions and service delivery. It's really hard to get your arms around this stuff. The transparency issues and the trust issues are very real, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth when we get to some specific case studies here in a minute. Touch briefly on the service levels. Can you really articulate those, and do the institutional stakeholders that might be asking for very high levels of service availability understand the trade-offs in terms of cost, required infrastructure, and whatnot? So the service level conversations are very, very critical in the cloud. There is a kind of tenuous service level commitment process to many cloud-based offerings. In some cases, you get what you get, and you don't get upset, and that may or may not be okay, depending on your other goals and guiding principles here. A significant advantage of cloud deployment and other managed services is in the time to deliver area. Peeling off those provisioning, procurement, deployment tasks, which can consume a lot of staff and bandwidth, can really allow you to focus on getting new services and new capabilities out to your stakeholders. And that can provide a big advantage, particularly if the institution organization is challenged to meet growing demands for new capabilities and new services. So to take some concrete examples, and then we'll actually touch on two specific client case studies that we'll share here. The point here is that we can illustrate some of the differences in strategic approach to service delivery, operating under different kinds of constraints, different priorities, without going into all the gory details on what each of these might look like. You might identify or kind of some of these themes might resonate with you, whether the characteristics of a nonprofit where there might be a very small budget, limited staff with skill gaps and aging infrastructure, heavily adopt open source in a uniform fashion to try to keep costs down. The cloud offerings may find some ways to alleviate some of those pressures. To contrast that with maybe a small or mid-sized institution that has a flat or declining IT budget, but in the face of that declining IT budget, there's pressure to maintain relevancy to your stakeholders. Just a couple of examples highlighted here. Recently there's quite the demand to deliver some flavor of mobile because people and students in particular expect to have a meaningful mobile experience these days. Contrast that with a potentially very large regional or national higher ed institution that is looking to extend its reach broadly through a distance ed program. There's a number of large institutions that are well down this path and have run into IT challenges. How do you deliver technology services at that kind of scale? And in many cases, the scale is uncertain. You don't know what the uptake is going to be. You don't know how fast it's going to grow, and there are lots of examples, maybe not lots, but certainly a few examples that are very noteworthy of technology failures as a result from trying to move aggressively in this area and not being able to address the scale demands quickly enough. Can infrastructure as a service and true dynamic provisioning help alleviate those kinds of risks and issues? And then lastly, there's a burgeoning education technology startup environment delivering services into both K-12 and higher ed. Those organizations have an entirely different profile, even though they're serving a student population in the end. Often cash flow constrained. They need to be fast. They are competing in a market where time to market is critical. There's lots of opportunities and risks. But startups typically don't invest a lot in operational staff. They're focused on product development and all the kind of necessary stuff you need to worry about, IT security and operations and deploying infrastructure. You may very well be short on those kinds of skills, and delegating all those responsibilities to somebody else, provided they can do it and you trust them, can offer quite an advantage. Two specific clients that we worked with. The first had a diverse mix of custom and commercial applications, but were in a very kind of complex environment. They were in need of an infrastructure refresh. They needed to right size where they were spending on their IT infrastructure. There was a bunch of supporting applications, and then there were client customer-facing applications. In the middle of bringing new capabilities to market, and it's sort of unknown how high the uptake was going to be on that. And they were under a lot of pressure to cut costs, and the cloud got touted as, well, this will solve all of our problems. Hey, can you guys just pick all this stuff up and move it for us? Well, we got in there and kind of took a look, and we said, whoa, wait a minute, this is a really complex landscape. Let's back up. Let's go back to your big goals, and let's kind of develop a re-hosting, a re-platforming strategy based around this complex environment, a divergent set of goals and conflicting areas. And what we actually did is we found that there was a set of guiding principles that we could enumerate that said, low-hanging fruit, simple, this goes to the cloud, period. One-offs, they aren't integrated with anything else, they don't have high availability requirements, or they're kind of business hours applications. Fine, easy, that goes. All right, at the next tier, let's look at these more complex environments where I've got service level integrations, I've got clusters of servers talking to other clusters of other servers. Do we move each of these services piecemeal, or do we do this whole? It turns out that the complexity of that whole environment, it needed to live in the same place. Turns out because of HA, cost, other reasons, it made sense to lift that all of those services and servers that composed that part of the delivery environment. Let's lift that whole thing into the cloud. We'll build the right kind of security constructs around that environment. We can keep all of our integrations, all of our kind of back channel networking, all that stuff lives in one common environment, and it's going to be easy to maintain and deploy, and the daily care and feeding doesn't become overly complex because we're now straddling lots of different kinds of infrastructure. And then the third category of services and servers that we looked at were around some really high value content. We had a lot of external data security and security policy issues around that stuff, and it really just made sense to keep it in a dedicated environment, again, because of the both real and perceived control and trust issues. We had an IT security infrastructure wrapped around that stuff that worked very well, that people had a lot of confidence in, and you know what, we're just not willing to upset the apple cart on that and step into an area where the risks are, frankly, a little more unknown. Contrast that with our second client that really had a low risk tolerance. They had been burned by some cloud-based things in the past, and the lack of a single point of accountability. When there was a production issue, you may or may not get somebody on the other end of the phone to help you figure it out or not. And they felt like they needed a single point of control, single point of accountability, that when something went wrong, didn't matter if it was infrastructure, it didn't matter if it was network service provider, it didn't matter if it was a security incident, whatever it was, they wanted a single throat to choke for their production environment. And because of their control and risk profile, the correct answer was to deploy them in a dedicated environment for production. The risk profile was substantially different for everything else. So for content staging, content QA, other software staging environments, all that other stuff went into the cloud because the risk profile was acceptable for those kinds of environments that were not supporting end users. So, the point here is just, what are the aspects of your strategic profile? Where does your institution sit on these various themes and topics? And from that, derive a set of strategies and guiding principles around which you can make decisions as you look to move things around. I'm going to touch just briefly here on some of the financial considerations. Casey did a great job of highlighting a couple of them. The first point I would make is that partnering with your financial management team is absolutely critical. You'll see that theme throughout the other points here. Not all IT managers, directors, and CIOs are great financial analysts. Some are. I know I'm not, and I'm always running down to our finance guys saying, "Hey, explain how this works to me, and what if we change this monthly recurring cost, or what if I incur this non-recurring cost as an investment? What's it going to do over the long haul?" So engaging with your financial folks also helps build support for the decision-making process and other things that you want to accomplish. Standard ROI and TCO analyses are great. You should do them. Just recognize that it's really hard to quantify the risk aspects. What is the cost of a data loss or a data compromise? What are the true costs of a service outage? There's ways to estimate them, but at the end of the day, they're frankly they're guesses. What we recommend in this area is build multiple cases. We'll create a case that you think is most likely to be realistic, but look at a best case and worst case scenario as well, and that might inform some of your decision making. Another area that we've seen really underrepresented in either ROI or TCO analyses is migrations, especially around labor and one-time expenses. Working with one particular group, they completely hand-waved on the migration labor and said, "Oh, well, that's not going to be that hard." And the situation we were talking about was actually many thousands of servers and many hundreds of services, and the idea that we could just dismiss the labor associated with migrations was surprising, to say the least. So again, be realistic and engage the people that are actually going to have to do the work, and get some realistic input on that. Casey touched on other financial impacts, particularly the shift from capital investment to operating expense. This is, again, where you need to really work with your finance team and understand what that means. Lots of organizations are well capitalized, and because the argument can be made that these capital investments advance the strategic goals, but commitments to monthly recurring charges that are then fixed long-term commitments, there's less of a stomach for those kinds of decisions. So again, looking at the financial position of your organization and the sensibilities around capital versus operating expense is important to do. Lastly, don't forget to factor in write-downs. If you're going to decommission a bunch of assets that are still on the books, what of that has to be written off, and that can substantially impact your finances as well. A lot of the cost savings in moving to cloud or SaaS or other managed services is predicated on being able to right-size your environment for the scale and demand. I've seen at least one example where a load was highly static, and the amount of infrastructure supporting it was actually cheaper to do a hardware refresh and just go buy several racks of new servers because they always need to be on. They ran 100%, at whatever utilization, 100% of the time. There have been cost reductions in a number of cloud services that analysis might turn up a different answer today. But if you can't take advantage of the dynamic aspects of cloud, that can materially affect the cost model. And if you can take advantage, if you do have a highly dynamic varying load, as many of the applications in education do, are the hooks and constructs in that software or those services there to actually do the dynamic provisioning? Or are you going to have to do that manually, and then suddenly does it become less of an attractive alternative? Lastly, disaster recovery and business continuity. Cloud can offer substantial savings there in not having a bunch of either a redundant data center, redundant servers spinning idle to meet your RTO and RPO objectives. But architecting that in the cloud can be quite an effort. Although many cloud offerings have high availability built into them, we've seen some fairly dramatic failures in the press on when those HA constructs have actually failed. You really have to dig in and understand how are you going to recover your data, how are you going to recover the rest of your operating environment in terms of servers and storage and whatnot, and can you really meet your recovery time objectives? Nevertheless, not having all that redundant infrastructure, provided you can put in the architectural effort, is an opportunity to look for some substantial cost savings. That's the conclusion of the material that we were going to present today. As I mentioned, we're posting a number of articles on the strategic elements involved in service delivery. The URL here is noted at the bottom. I encourage folks to take a look at those articles as they come out every week or so. Thanks for attending.